Rust isn't just oxidation, it's a stubborn refusal to die. Augustus tasted diesel and dust before he even opened his eyes. Next door, $500,000 of computerized steel sat paralyzed in the mud. In his barn, a 70-year-old iron ghost was about to wake up. The barn smelled of dry rot, mouse droppings, and 70 years of evaporated oil. Augustus lay on his back on a piece of flattened cardboard, staring up into the guts of the 1,952 Massey Harris. A bead of sweat, thick with black grime, traced a slow path down his temple and stung the corner of his eye. He didn't blink. If he moved his left arm even a fraction of an inch, the wrench would slip off the rusted hex nut, and he'd punch his knuckles into the jagged edge of the grain pan. Again. "Come on, you obstinate bitch," he whispered. His voice was gravel, parched and flat. He applied pressure. The muscles in his forearm corded, straining against the immovable joint of metal. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, a sharp crack echoed in the hollow space of the barn, followed by the metallic screech of threads finally letting go. Augustus exhaled, letting his head drop back against the concrete. The smell of rust and oxidized grease was a physical weight in the air. He slid out from under the combine, his knees popping like dry kindling. He was 68, and his joints reminded him of this fact with every shift in the barometric pressure. Standing up, he wiped his hands on a rag that was already more oil than cotton. He looked at the machine. It was a monstrous, lumbering thing. Faded, chipped red paint, a massive, exposed steering column, belts and pulleys hanging out in the open like exposed viscera. It was a mechanical dinosaur, obsolete the day the first enclosed cabs rolled off the assembly lines. And Augustus was dumping his meager pension into it. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drifted through the open barn doors. Augustus didn't turn around right away. He took a slow, deliberate sip from a mug of coffee that had gone cold and metallic 2 hours ago. Still playing museum curator, art? Andrew stood in the doorway. He was 34, wore clean denim, and boots that had never stepped in fresh manure. Andrew farmed the 2,000 acres, wrapping around Augustus's modest 200. Andrew's operation was corporate, sleek, and highly leveraged. He didn't drive tractors. He managed mobile data centers that happened to harvest wheat. Augustus spat a fleck of coffee ground onto the dirt floor. "It runs." "It leaks," Andrew corrected, stepping inside. He looked at the puddle of dark fluid weeping from the combine's axle. "I'm telling you, Art, the scrap metal guy from Kearney is doing a run next week. He'd give you enough for this relic to put a down payment on a decent used side-by-side, something with a suspension. Your back would thank you." "My back is fine." Augustus picked up a grease gun. He didn't look at Andrew. He hated the way Andrew smelled like high-end aftershave and air conditioning. It didn't belong in a barn. "Just trying to look out for you," Andrew said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture that felt entirely rehearsed. "I saw you out here last night at midnight. You're killing yourself over a machine that loses half the grain out the back and chews up the rest. It's bad business." "I don't recall asking for a business consultation." Augustus pumped the handle of the grease gun. Squelch, squelch. The thick, red grease oozed into the Zerk fitting. Andrew sighed, the sound loud in the quiet barn. "Suit yourself. But harvest is in 3 weeks. If that thing breaks a belt in the middle of your field, don't expect my boys to pull you out. We're on a tight schedule this year. The yield monitors are projecting record numbers." "I'll keep that in mind," Augustus muttered. Andrew lingered for a moment, waiting for a concession that wasn't coming, then turned and walked out. A minute later, his spotless white pickup truck crunched away down the drive. Augustus stopped pumping the grease gun. He leaned his forehead against the cold, unyielding iron of the combine's side panel. His hands were shaking, not from exertion, but from a quiet, suffocating coil of anger. He knew what the town thought of him. He'd heard the murmurs at the diner in town, over plates of runny eggs and burnt toast. Crazy old Art, stubborn as a mule, drowning in the past. They laughed at the sight of him driving down the shoulder of the county road, exposed to the sun and the dust, deafened by the roar of a straight pipe engine, while the modern farmers floated by in soundproof, climate-controlled glass boxes, listening to satellite radio and letting GPS steer the wheel to the millimeter. There was a profound isolation in being the butt of a county-wide joke. Augustus wasn't blind. He knew the Massey was inefficient. He knew parts were impossible to find, requiring him to spend nights at a lathe, machining replacement pins out of scrap steel. So why did he keep it? It wasn't nostalgia. Augustus wasn't a sentimental man. He didn't look at the faded red paint and see the golden days of his youth. He looked at it and saw metal, physics, and consequence. He kept it because he could understand it. If a belt snapped, he could see it. If the fuel mixture was lean, he could smell it in the exhaust. If the bearings were failing, he could feel the vibration in the soles of his boots. The machine didn't hide its flaws behind a digital screen. It didn't require a proprietary software diagnostic tool to tell him what was broken. It demanded labor, but in return, it offered transparency. In a world that was rapidly becoming an opaque black box of circuitry and subscription fees, the combine was the last thing Augustus felt he had control over. He wiped his hands again, grabbed a heavy wrench, and climbed the precarious metal ladder to the operator's seat. The seat was a simple steel pan, rusted at the edges. He sat down. The view was unobstructed, looking straight down the throat of the header. He reached out and traced his calloused thumb over the throttle lever. It was worn smooth from decades of friction. "Just you and me," Augustus said to the empty barn. The silence that answered him felt heavy, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. The shift in the weather didn't announce itself with thunder. It started as a subtle change in the air, a drop in barometric pressure that Augustus felt radiating deep within the cartilage of his bad knee. It was the second week of September. The wheat was blonde, heavy, and nodding on its stalks. It was perfectly dry. It was ready. But the sky to the northwest was wrong. Augustus stood on his back porch, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. The horizon wasn't the typical hazy blue of late summer. It was a dense, sickly shade of bruised plum, edged with a pale, jaundiced green. The air was entirely still. Not a single leaf on the ancient oak tree in his front yard moved. It was the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The humidity wrapped around him like a wet wool blanket, suffocating and thick. He took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like ash. A severe unseasonal squall line was moving in. The radio reports that morning were frantic. A massive low-pressure system, dragging down Arctic air to collide with the stifling late summer heat. They were predicting localized microbursts, hail the size of golf balls, and a deluge of rain that would turn the dry fields into impassable bogs. Any wheat left standing by tomorrow morning would be beaten flat into the mud, ruined, a total loss. Across the barbed wire fence, the horizon was alive with activity. Andrew's operation was running at full tilt. 4 massive, bright green combines moved in a staggered diagonal formation across the vast golden expanse. They looked like alien insects, their massive reels spinning, devouring the wheat at an astonishing pace. Behind them trailed large grain carts, pulled by equally massive tractors. Augustus watched them with a tight jaw. He hated to admit it, but there was a ruthless efficiency to it. They were stripping hundreds of acres an hour. They would beat the storm. Andrew would get his crop in, secure his payout, and continue his expansion. Augustus turned away and walked toward his barn. His own 200 acres were waiting. He climbed up into the seat of the Massey Harris. He pulled the choke, set the throttle, and pressed the heavy starter button. The starter motor whined a high, desperate sound. Nothing. Augustus frowned. He adjusted the choke and tried again. The engine sputtered, spat out a puff of black smoke, and died. The smell of unburnt gasoline filled the air. Flooded. He hit the steering wheel with the heel of his hand, a sharp, stinging blow. "Not today," he hissed through his teeth. "Don't you do this to me today?" He climbed down, grabbed a wrench, and began the tedious process of pulling the spark plugs to dry them out, his hands moving with frantic, jerky precision. The air was getting heavier. The sky was darkening, the plum color bleeding outward, swallowing the sun. An hour passed. Augustus's knuckles were bleeding where he'd scraped them against the hot manifold. He finally got the plugs back in, reconnected the wires, and climbed back up. He pressed the starter. The old flathead 6-cylinder engine caught. It roared to life with a deafening, unsynchronized clatter, vibrating so hard the entire chassis shuddered. Black smoke billowed from the vertical exhaust pipe, coating the roof of the barn in soot. It was loud. It was violent. But it was running. Augustus engaged the separator clutch. The belt screeched in protest before catching, and the massive internal threshing cylinder began to spin. A cloud of ancient dust blew out the back. He shifted into gear and rumbled out of the barn, the heavy lug tires biting into the dry dirt. He had barely reached the edge of his field when he felt it. A drop in temperature so sudden it felt like walking into a meat locker. A cold wind whipped across the plains, flattening the wheat. Then came the sound. It wasn't thunder. It was a high, tearing sound, like a massive sheet of canvas being ripped in half. Augustus slammed on the brakes and looked toward Andrew's fields. A localized dry lightning storm, the precursor to the massive front, was rolling directly over the corporate farm. The sky flickered with violent, silent strobes of white light. And then, a blinding flash, a pillar of pure plasma, connected the bruised sky to the earth, striking dead center in the middle of Andrew's fleet. The thunderclap hit a second later, a concussive wave of sound that physically rattled Augustus's teeth in his skull. He ducked instinctively, shielding his face. When he looked back up, the scene had changed. The frantic, synchronized movement of Andrew's fleet had ceased. The 4 massive combines were dead in their tracks. The grain carts were stopped. Augustus idled the Massey, watching. 5 minutes passed. 10. He could see tiny figures Andrew's operators climbing out of the air-conditioned cabs, standing on the ladders, looking confused. They were waving their arms. Augustus cut the engine on the Massey. The sudden silence was jarring, replaced only by the rising howl of the wind. He climbed down and walked to the fence line. The smell of ozone was thick in the air, sharp and metallic, like burning wires. He could hear yelling carrying on the wind. He squinted. Andrew's white pickup was tearing across the field, bouncing violently over the ruts, rushing toward the stalled machines. They weren't moving, none of them. Augustus knew enough about the modern machines to know what had likely happened. They were rolling computers. A strike that close, an electromagnetic surge of that magnitude, wouldn't just blow a fuse. It would fry the delicate CAN bus networks. It would scramble the proprietary control modules. Or, more likely, it triggered a critical localized safety fault in the system's central brain, instantly immobilizing the drivetrains to prevent mechanical failure. And because of the DRM, the digital rights management software built into every bolt and sensor, only a certified technician with a proprietary laptop could clear the codes and unlock the transmissions. A technician who was currently 2 towns over, likely dealing with a dozen other frantic calls as the storm front wreaked havoc on the grid. The sky bruised darker. The wind howled louder. The first fat, heavy drop of rain hit Augustus's cheek, cold as ice. Andrew's crop was trapped. 400 acres of prime, shattering wheat, directly in the path of the storm, with the multi-million-dollar tools to harvest it rendered into very heavy, very expensive lawn ornaments. Augustus stood at the fence line for a long time. The wind whipped his gray hair into his eyes. He looked at the stalled green behemoths, then turned and looked at his faded, leaking, purely mechanical red combine. A small, ugly feeling bloomed in his chest. It was vindication. It was petty and sour, but it felt good for exactly 3 seconds. Then the reality of the sky above them crushed it. The rain hadn't started in earnest yet, but the air was spitting sharp, stinging droplets blown horizontal by the rising wind. Augustus was back under the shed roof, adjusting the tension on the Massey's unloading auger belt. He was working methodically, ignoring the chaotic tableau playing out on the other side of his property line. He heard the footsteps before he saw him, heavy, frantic boots splashing through the dry dirt that was rapidly turning to a slick paste. Augustus didn't look up from his wrench. Art, the voice was breathless, panicked. Augustus tightened the nut, gave the belt a firm push to check the deflection, and finally turned. Andrew stood there. The corporate sheen was gone. His expensive denim was smeared with grease. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and the spitting rain. He looked pale, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked like a man watching his house burn down. "They're bricked," Andrew said. He didn't offer a greeting. His chest heaved. The whole fleet. The strike hit the main communications tower on the ridge, surged down through the localized RTK network. The central hubs in the cabs isolated to protect the mainframes, but it tripped the electronic transmission locks. They won't move. They won't even idle. Augustus wiped his wrench with his oily rag. He took his time. He looked at the rag, then up at Andrew. "Call your dealer," Augustus said, his voice flat. "I did. Cell service is dropping in and out. When I finally got through, they said their main servers in Des Moines are down because of the storm. They can't push an over-the-air reset. And the nearest field tech is stuck behind a washed-out bridge on Route 9. He won't be here until tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow afternoon," Augustus repeated slowly. He looked up at the sky. The plum color was completely gone, replaced by a churning, boiling charcoal. "It's going to dump 3 inches of water and hail before midnight." "I know," Andrew's voice cracked. It was an awful sound, the sound of a proud man breaking. "I know, Art. I have 400 acres left, the bottomland. If it floods, if the hail hits it." He swallowed hard. "I'm leveraged to the hilt, Art. The new tractors, the pivot irrigators. I need this yield. If I lose that bottomland, the bank is going to call my notes." Augustus stood in silence. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn's siding, a high, mournful sound. This was the moment. This was the moment Augustus had secretly, guiltily fantasized about every time Andrew made a snide remark, every time the diner crowd chuckled at his rust bucket. The mighty falling. The arrogance of silicon and debt, laid low by the unyielding reality of nature. He felt the vindication rise in his throat. He wanted to tell Andrew to choke on his GPS. He wanted to tell him to go sit in his soundproof cab and watch his livelihood get beaten into the mud. He opened his mouth to say it. But as he looked at Andrew's face, he didn't see a corporate manager. He just saw a kid, a terrified kid, who was about to lose the dirt his grandfather had bled for. And beneath the vindication, Augustus felt something else. A deep, instinctual revulsion. Augustus was a farmer. You didn't let good grain rot. You didn't let the earth's yield get destroyed if you could stop it. It was a sin against the dirt. It was a violation of the only covenant Augustus believed in. You work the land, you protect the harvest. Letting it die out of spite wasn't just punishing Andrew. It was an insult to the work itself. Augustus closed his eyes for a brief second. The internal contradiction tore at him. He hated himself for being soft, and he hated himself for wanting to be cruel. He tossed the wrench onto the workbench. It landed with a loud, final clatter. "My hopper only holds 40 bushels, Augustus said, his voice hard, devoid of any warmth. "It's going to mean a lot of trips to the grain cart. And she doesn't have lights. When the sun goes down, we're running blind." Andrew stared at him, uncomprehending for a second. Then, relief washed over his face so intensely, his knees actually buckled a fraction of an inch. "Art, Shut up," Augustus snapped, walking past him. "Don't thank me. I ain't doing it for you. I'm doing it because letting wheat die is a damn crime." He grabbed a heavy canvas coat from a nail on the wall and shoved his arms into it. "Get your boys. Tell them to get the manual grain carts hooked up to the old diesel pickups. The computerized tractors are dead weight. We need mechanical engines. Something with a carburetor and a distributor cap." Andrew nodded frantically, pulling his phone out, realizing it had no signal, and shoving it back in his pocket. "I'll run back. I'll get them." "You do that," Augustus said. He walked out into the spitting rain and climbed the metal ladder to the seat of the Massey Harris. He sat in the exposed iron pan. The cold wind bit through his canvas coat. He reached down and gripped the throttle. He pressed the starter. The Flathead 6 groaned. It fought the cold. "Rrrr! Come on," Augustus growled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You owe me this. For all the blood and the grease. You owe me." He adjusted the choke by a millimeter, pressed again. Bang! A backfire echoed like a gunshot, followed instantly by the deep, rhythmic, ground-shaking roar of internal combustion. A thick plume of black smoke rocketed into the gray sky, whipping away in the wind. The massive machine shuddered, vibrating with raw, unbridled kinetic energy. There were no screens to boot up, no satellite connections to establish, no software permissions to request, just fuel, fire, and iron. Augustus slammed the heavy gear shift into first. The gears ground together in a harsh metallic scream before seating. He let out the heavy clutch. The 1,952 Massey Harris lunged forward out of the barn, its heavy lug tires tearing deep gashes into the wet earth. Augustus steered it out of his own yard, turning the massive steering wheel hand over hand, feeling the resistance of the heavy steering linkage in his shoulders. He drove it straight toward the property line, aiming for the fence gate that led into Andrew's unharvested bottomland. Behind him, the rain began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets. Ahead of him, 400 acres of golden wheat thrashed wildly in the storm wind, waiting to be saved. The rain did not fall. It attacked. It blew in horizontally, a freezing, abrasive sheet of water that hit Augustus's face like loose gravel. Within 3 minutes, his heavy canvas coat was soaked through, sticking to his shoulders and leaching the body heat straight out of his bones. He didn't care. He was locked into the rhythm of the machine. The 1,952 Massey Harris chewed into the first row of Andrew's bottomland. The massive wooden reel, spinning like a water wheel, battered the nodding wheat heads backward onto the sickle bar. The triangular blades, honed by Augustus's own files just 2 nights ago, sheared through the thick stalks with a rapid, mechanical chattering that cut through the howl of the storm. Augustus sat completely exposed on the metal pan seat. He had to lean forward, squinting through the deluge, reading the contour of the land by the subtle shifts in the machine's tilt. His left hand rode the heavy steering wheel, fighting the deep, muddy ruts the corporate machines had left behind. His right hand hovered over the header height control, a purely manual lever that required actual shoulder strength to adjust. The wheat was dampening fast. Wet straw was tough. It didn't shatter. It tore. He felt the strain in the soles of his boots before he heard it. The vibration of the threshing cylinder changed pitch, dropping from a high-speed hum to a heavy, labored thudding. The flathead 6-cylinder engine lugged down, black smoke pouring thicker from the vertical exhaust. Augustus instinctively backed off the ground speed, clutching in slightly to give the cylinder time to chew through the heavy, wet mass. He could smell it, a damp, green, pulverized odor mixing with the sharp tang of unburnt diesel and hot engine oil. Clank, clank, whine. It cleared. The engine RPM spiked back up. Augustus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced over his shoulder. The tiny 40-bushel grain hopper behind him was already half full. The old combine was completely inadequate for a 400-acre field. It was like trying to empty a swimming pool with a teacup. To his right, headlights pierced the gray, driving rain. Andrew's crew had figured it out. A battered 1,998 Dodge Ram, paint peeling and tailgate rusted through, came bouncing violently across the cut stubble. It was pulling a gravity wagon, a rusted, sloped-sided steel bin that hadn't seen use since the 90s. The driver, one of Andrew's young, clean-cut operators who usually spent his days monitoring touchscreens, looked absolutely terrified behind the wheel of the fishtailing truck. Augustus didn't slow down. He couldn't. If he stopped the forward momentum in this mud, the heavy lug tires of the Massey would dig in, and they'd be buried to the axles. He yanked the rope that engaged the unloading auger. The auger swung out, a rusty metal chute hovering in the air. The Dodge Ram accelerated, trying to match Augustus's pace. The kid was erratic, surging too far forward, then hitting the brakes and falling behind. "Hold a line, you idiot!" Augustus screamed, though his voice was entirely swallowed by the engine roar and the thunder. He feather-tapped his own brakes, bringing the spout of the auger directly over the gravity wagon. A thick, golden waterfall of wheat poured out, instantly soaking up the rain in the wagon's bed. It took 40 seconds to empty the hopper. Augustus disengaged the auger and waved the truck off. The Dodge peeled away, tires spinning uselessly in the mud, before catching and tearing off toward the silos. Another old farm truck, this one, a dented Chevy with a flatbed, was already circling, waiting for its turn. They settled into a brutal, grinding loop. Cut, thresh, fill, dump on the move, repeat. By hour 3, the sun disappeared entirely, swallowed by the dense cloud cover long before actual twilight. The Massey Harris had no headlights. The wiring harness had rotted away decades ago. The world shrank to the small pool of illumination provided by the headlights of the trucks flanking him. When they pulled away to dump, Augustus drove blind. He navigated entirely by feel, trusting the vibration of the sickle bar to tell him if he was cutting wheat or chewing dirt. His body was a map of acute agonies. The arthritis in his knees throbbed in time with the engine block. His lower back was seized into a rigid block of pain from the unyielding steel seat. The icy rain had numbed his fingers so completely he couldn't tell if he was gripping the steering wheel or if his hands were just locked in place by rigor mortis. He was miserable. He cursed Andrew. He cursed the weather. He cursed himself for being a sentimental old fool who couldn't mind his own business. Bang! The sound was sharp, violently abrupt, and followed by the sickening shriek of tearing metal. The Massey lunged to a halt, the engine stalling out instantly. The sudden silence was deafening, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Augustus's chest hit the steering wheel hard. He gasped, tasting copper. "God damn it," he hissed, spitting a mix of saliva and blood into the darkness. The headlights of the Dodge Ram swung around, illuminating the front of the combine. Augustus climbed down the ladder. His knees gave out on the second rung, and he fell the last 3 feet, landing heavily in the ankle-deep mud. He didn't stay down. He forced himself up, grabbing a heavy crowbar from the toolbox. Andrew came splashing over from the passenger side of the truck. He was holding a heavy-duty flashlight. "What happened? Did the engine blow?" Andrew yelled over the wind. "No," Augustus grunted, snatching the flashlight from Andrew's hand. He marched to the side of the machine, popping the heavy metal access shield that covered the main drive belt. He shined the beam into the guts of the combine. The main drive belt, a massive band of reinforced rubber, was intact, but the threshing cylinder was jammed solid. The wet wheat had clumped together, creating a massive, impenetrable slug of vegetation that had wedged between the cylinder teeth and the concave grate. The shear pin, the small sacrificial bolt designed to break before the main shaft snapped, had sheared cleanly in half. "It's plugged," Augustus said. His voice was exhausted, stripped of all venom. Shear pin gave out. Good thing, too, or it would have twisted the drive shaft into a pretzel. "Can we fix it?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling. He looked at the vast expanse of unharvested wheat still swaying in the dark. "I can," Augustus said, "but I have to pull the slug out by hand, and you have to find me a new pin. Toolbox, bottom drawer. Look for a 1/2-inch bolt with 2 notches on the head." Augustus didn't wait. He wedged his upper body into the access port. The metal was freezing. He reached into the dark, narrow gap between the razor-sharp cylinder teeth. He grabbed a handful of the wet, compacted straw and pulled. It was like trying to pull concrete. He gritted his teeth and pulled harder. The jagged edge of a cylinder bar sliced cleanly across the back of his bare hand. Augustus didn't flinch. He didn't have the energy to care. Blood, warm and slick, mixed with the cold rain and the grease on his skin. He dug his fingers deeper, tearing at the plug, ripping it out in agonizingly small chunks. 10 minutes passed, then 20. His muscles burned with lactic acid. His breath plumed in the cold air, illuminated by the flashlight resting on the muddy tire. Finally, he felt the cylinder give a fraction of an inch. He grabbed the crowbar, wedged it against the main pulley, and threw his entire body weight into it. With a wet, sucking sound, the massive slug of straw dislodged and fell into the grain pan. Augustus pulled himself out of the machine. He was covered in mud, grease, and his own blood. He leaned against the wet iron tire, chest heaving. Andrew was there, holding out a greasy bolt. "Is this it?" Augustus took it. "Yeah." He climbed back up, hammered the new pin into the drive shaft coupling, and tightened the locking nut with shaking hands. He didn't say a word to Andrew. He just climbed back up into the metal seat. He pressed the starter. The flathead 6 caught on the first crank, spitting a defiant ball of blue flame out the exhaust. Augustus threw it into gear. The wheels spun, bit into the hard pan beneath the mud, and the old combine lurched forward back into the dark. The hail started at 4:12 a.m. It wasn't the apocalyptic size the radio threatened, but it fell with absolute fury. Pea-sized stones pinged off the sheet metal housing of the Massey Harris like dropped ball bearings. The sound was a frantic, metallic drumbeat, drowning out the roar of the flathead engine. Augustus was cutting the final pass. He sat hunched over the wheel, chin tucked into his collar. The field beside him was no longer a golden promise. It was a wasteland of trampled mud, deep ruts, and sheared stubble. The small hopper filled for the last time. Augustus swung the rusty auger out, aligned it over the waiting gravity wagon, and dumped the remaining 20 bushels. The grain cascaded down with a dull shushing sound against the steel. He reached down and cut the engine. The massive machine shuddered violently, then died. The silence that rushed in was heavy, broken only by the relentless tapping of hail. Augustus didn't move. He couldn't. His boots felt like cement. His hands, gripping the steering wheel, were locked into tight, frozen claws. The arthritis in his lower back had seized into a solid pillar of radiating agony. He rested his forehead against the wet iron. He smelled hot diesel, wet rust, and his own stale sweat. He had done it. 400 acres. Cut, threshed, and hauled by a machine belonging in a scrapyard and a fleet of rusted trucks, driven by terrified kids. Augustus slowly unpeeled his hands and climbed down the ladder. His boots hit the mud with a wet slap. His legs trembled so violently he leaned against the massive rubber tire to keep from collapsing. The Dodge Ram splashed to a halt beside him. Andrew got out. The corporate farmer looked destroyed. His expensive jacket was soaked and smeared with black grease. His face was pale, hollowed out by adrenaline. He looked at the empty field, then at the rusting gravity wagon full of saved grain. Finally, he looked at Augustus. Andrew's jaw worked, but no words came out. He stood in the freezing hail, his shoulders dropping as the immense, crushing weight of imminent bankruptcy physically left his body. "Don't," Augustus said. His voice was a raspy whisper. "Don't make a speech. I don't want to hear it." Augustus turned his back. He began the long, limping walk back toward his own property line. The Massey Harris remained parked deep in the mud, cooling rapidly in the storm. The morning broke with violent, pristine clarity. The storm front had blown through, taking the suffocating humidity with it. The sky was a painfully bright, piercing blue. Augustus sat on his back porch. The coffee in his hands was actually hot, though his fingers were so stiff and wrapped in bandages that he had trouble gripping the ceramic handle. The air smelled of crushed vegetation and ozone. The devastation across the county was absolute. The neighboring wheat was gone, pounded into a gray-green paste by the hail, except for Andrew's bottomland, which was a sea of clean-cut, jagged stubble. Augustus took a sip. It tasted like salvation and cheap ibuprofen. Tires crunched on wet gravel. Andrew's white pickup now splattered in mud up to the windows pulled into the driveway. Andrew got out. He walked slower today. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. "The technicians are finally out there," Andrew said quietly, nodding back toward his property. Augustus looked. The 4 massive green combines were sitting exactly where they had died. Tiny figures in reflective vests were huddled around open access panels with laptops. "They have to replace the master control modules on all 4 machines," Andrew said, a bitter edge to his voice. $30,000 a pop, plus labor, and wait for parts from Germany. Augustus took another sip of coffee. He didn't gloat. The universe had already made the point. Andrew pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket and placed it on the small wooden table. "That's standard custom harvest rates, plus a premium for night work, and enough to completely rebuild the engine on that Massey." Augustus stared at the envelope. It was enough to retire, to fix the sagging barn roof. He picked it up, pulled out a stack of $100 bills, and did some mental math. He peeled off a fraction of the stack, exactly enough to cover his fuel, the standard per acre rate, and 2 new drive belts. He placed the smaller stack in his lap and tossed the envelope back onto the table. It landed with a soft thud. "Take the rest back," Augustus said, staring at the fields. Andrew frowned. "Art, I owe you. You saved my farm. Please, just take it." "I took what I'm owed," Augustus said, his voice flat. "I'm a farmer, Andrew, not a charity case, and not a mercenary. I charge what the work is worth. But the machine is fine." Augustus cut him off. He finally looked at Andrew, his pale blue eyes hard. "It leaks. It's loud. It's a pain in the ass. But when I tell it to move, it moves. Nobody in Germany gets to tell me whether or not I can harvest my own damn crop." Andrew stared at him. The tension wasn't gone. They weren't friends. They were just 2 men who had survived a battle on the same side. Slowly, Andrew pocketed the envelope. "I'll have my guys tow the Massey back to your barn this afternoon, if that's all right." "Just don't scratch the paint," Augustus muttered, looking away. "And tell that kid in the Dodge to learn how to hold a straight line." A faint smile touched Andrew's mouth. "I will." Andrew walked to his truck and drove away slowly. respectfully avoiding the deep ruts. Augustus sat alone on the porch. He looked down the hill. The 1952 Massey Harris sat in the mud, small, ugly, and ancient against the landscape. A small puddle of black oil was slowly forming beneath the rear axle, shimmering with a rainbow sheen in the morning sun. Augustus closed his eyes, listening to the quiet. He would have to fix that leak tomorrow. If you felt the rumble of that old flathead engine, or know someone who still believes in the power of keeping things running with their own two hands, hit that like button. Don't let this story get lost in the algorithm. Share it with anyone who appreciates raw, mechanical resilience. And make sure to subscribe for more grounded, hard-hitting stories about the people and machines that refuse to quit. See you in the next one.